Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop, Woodworking Myths. We're going to bust a half a dozen of them, and I can't wait. Stay with us. I'm Rob Cosman, and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Hit the notification bell so you'll receive alerts when we release a new video. And anytime we use a special tool, we'll always leave a description down below. All right, let's get to work. We've been woodworking for a very long time, and I don't mean me personally. How long have we had trees? How long have we needed a place to sit or to lie down? As a result of that, woodworking opinions have been expressed, and expressed enough or forcefully enough, somebody picks it up to be the truth. It gets passed from generation to generation. Nobody ever challenges it, and all of a sudden it's the gospel. Well, I'm going to go through 6. I'm going to start with my pet one. I can't tell you how many times I've done a wood show and had somebody from the audience reach in and lay my plane over like that. Let me tell you something. My bench is made out of maple. I don't do any metal working on this bench. It's only done woodworking. That blade is not going to be harmed by sitting down like that any more than it's going to be harmed sitting on a piece of wood that I happen to be planing. Besides that, how often is your blade ever sticking out so far that all of the weight of the plane would be resting on the blade? And even if it did, so what? That blade is much harder than the wood. If you lay it on its side, you risk having the blade exposed, and if there's something metal on your bench, there's a chance that something is going to be hit, or that blade is going to be bumped. Setting it like this has its risk, not as many. If somebody comes along and pushes your plane, it may dig into your bench. Now that's not going to harm your plane, but I certainly don't want my bench being dug up. The other problem that I avoid is the blade advancing and retracting. There's a fair bit of resistance preventing that from moving accidentally. However, I think that setting it on its side, any kind of a bump like that, there's enough weight in that blade that it may shift it sideways so that when you start planing, it has been skewed to one side or the other. Bit of a weak argument, but my primary argument is A, it's my plane and I can do whatever I want with it. B, it is not going to harm the blade by setting it like that. And C, it's the most comfortable thing for me to do when planing, to set it down and pick it up the same way I used it. If I were to ask 6 woodworkers of the 3 surfaces on this piece of maple, the face, the edge, or the end, which of the 3 is the most difficult to plane? I guarantee you all 6 would say the end grain. All right, so let's put that piece of end grain in there. Now, theory has it, or folklore has it, that a block plane is the best plane for planing end grain. Well, let me just cut a little chamfer on the back side so we don't split that out. Here's the reason why that I disagree with that. Number one, if you were to compare my 5.5 to the block plane, this one probably weighs 4 or 5 times what that one does. Might even be 6. So you're planing the hardest or most difficult part of that board. Do you want more weight or less weight behind the cutting edge? Well, I'm going to say more weight. It is so much easier to plow through tough end grain when you've got the weight of a good-sized plane behind you than it is to try to push that blade with nothing more than elbow grease, pushing that blade through that piece of wood. Now, they will argue that, well, it's the lower angle. Well, let's examine that. This is the easiest one to deal with first. Remove the lever cap, take the blade out. On a bench plane, the bevel's on the bottom side. So whatever angle this thing called the frog is holding the blade, that is the angle with which you are planing the wood. And in this case, it's 45 degrees. All right, let's look at the block plane. Take the lever cap. The first thing you'll notice is that the blade is bevel top side. So what happens is, in order to figure out the angle that you're planing, you take the bedding angle of the blade, which on a low angle block is 12 degrees. Add the primary bevel on the blade, which typically is 25, so now you're planing at 37. However, most people include micro bevels. and quickly. The purpose of a micro bevel is so that you don't have to polish all of this part of the bevel. You only deal with the part that is actually required. And that's usually going to involve anywhere from 3 to 5 degrees. So 12 plus 25 is 37, plus 4 or 5 is either got you planing at 41 or 42 degrees, maybe even higher. Is there that much of a difference, planing from 42 degrees versus 45? I say no. Just my opinion, but I'm telling you no. I use a block plane as a one-handed tool when you're chamfering the edge of a board. Anytime a 5.5 or something like that is going to be too difficult to use, or you want it to be just one-handed, that is the plane of choice. But for dealing with this tough cut on the end grain of a board, a heavier plane is going to be so much easier to use. The angle, as long as the blade is sharp, the angle of attack takes second or third place compared to the sharpness of the blade. So for that reason, if you're dealing with end grain, and I'll throw in this too, because typically we use a shooting board on end grain. And it's a whole lot easier to push a heavy plane like that and go sailing through the end grain than it is, as I mentioned, to use all elbow grease trying to push a plane that size through that same piece of end grain. If you're going to deal with end grain, get yourself a decent plane that has a lot of weight. A lot easier. Myth number 2, busted. But you'll hear people say about using a wet rag to wipe off excess glue. Never. Let me show you something. I had the great fortune of learning from Dale Nish. And Dale's died several years ago, but he was a world-renowned woodworker, ran the program at BYU, and was a very smart man. He said you had the 5 best wood spreaders on one hand. When you're doing it, applying glue that is to the edge, simply start with your bead and use your finger. I use my thumb to guide it so I can keep the nozzle right in the middle and put a nice even layer of glue. Go back and fill in any spots that you may be missing. Put your second piece on. I never bother gluing both. And go ahead and clamp. Now, if you don't have a whole bunch of glue running on you, it's as simple as I would prefer to simply allow that to get jelly, slightly dry, then go in and just scrape a little bit off. If you take a wet rag, particularly on something open porous like oak, and start trying to wipe that off, and you're almost for sure going to get glue down in those pores that you're not going to be able to get out, and you're going to find that glue when you go to put a finish on, and all of a sudden the finish doesn't take in the area where the glue has been spread. So whoever came up with the idea of wiping off glue with a wet rag, I say, is not a smart way of doing it. You're better off to be more careful with your gluing and not get it there. And if it does, wait till it just starts to gel a little bit, and then you can scrape it off with a chisel or a scraper. Much easier to control and doesn't get spread all over the place. Folks tell me that you should lift your plane on the backstroke, set it down before you go again. I say hogwash. So much easier, and I'll last a lot longer if I can simply pull that plane back along that same piece of wood. Helps keep me in the rhythm. The risk associated with lifting it off, number 1, this thing's heavy. Number 2, every time you set it down, if you jar it at all, you may change the setting of the blade, as I mentioned. This way, I find in teaching new people how to do this, it's so much easier to stay on that same plane by not lifting off, but simply coming back. Just get the blade out beyond the edge before you start the next stroke. Not a huge issue, but why not make it as pleasurable and as easy as possible? Myth number 4 this time, and I'd say that one's busted. On to 5. Wooden furniture is cheaper to build than to buy. I almost have to laugh when I say that. Here's an example. This is a small hall table. It was actually one of our first projects in our hand tool workshop. If you were to go through, first thing you have to realize is, let's say there's 6 board feet in this project. Now a board foot is a measure for wood. It's 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick. If I wanted 6 board feet, premium board feet that I could use in this, I would probably have to purchase 10. Why? Well, whenever you buy a board, you always run the risk of having checks or cracks in the end. So there's going to be 2 or 3 or 4 inches you have to waste out there. You may have a knot somewhere that's in the wrong spot. Rule of thumb, you just have to factor in 30 to 40% waste. So that's going to increase the price. And lumber is not cheap. Good wood is not cheap. If you were to factor in all of the tools involved, there's mortise and tenon joints in here. That means there's a square part of this reduced in size that fits into a rectangular shaped hole. One here, one here, one here, one here. Legs are tapered. Got a little bead cut right here. That was done with a special tool. The top has to be processed, even if you did it with hand tools. You're talking about stones, you're talking about planes, chisels, saws. It is definitely cheaper to buy than it is to build. Well, I suppose if you're going to do a whole lot of it, you may be able to break even in the end. And certainly you're going to be able to build a whole lot better than you can buy. But to simply look at one piece of furniture and say, I could build that a lot cheaper than we could buy it, that's probably not true. Like I said, don't let your spouse see this. So we're going to call that myth number 5 busted. I can't think of a domestic wood, regardless of the figure, that can't be planed to perfection. Here's a piece of nice bird's eye maple. I'm using my 5.5. Throat isn't particularly tight. No high angle blade, just a regular blade, properly sharpened with a very, very light cut. And I will go through several passes and then let you have a look. I'm actually going to advance that blade a little bit more, take a little heavier cut. And there's what we're pulling off, a piece of bird's eye. If you learn to sharpen your plane, you have a decent blade and a decent plane, that meaning it's flat, mostly, you will be able to plane things like bird's eye maple and leave a flawless surface. You do not have to scrape woods like that. Save your scraper for exotic woods that just will not respond to a hand plane. Enjoy hand planing and the beautiful surface that you get as a result of it. Domestic woods, you can plane. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. Now, I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools that we actually manufacture right here, as well as our workshops, both in person and online. Good luck.